Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Katy Balls, the Spectator's political editor and your host this week. Jeremy Hunt gave his maiden budget this week. What's the shape of the UK economy? And Kate Andrews writes this week's cover piece on the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. Are we seeing a failure of the banking system as a whole? Kate will join me with David Miles. Gus Carter writes in this week's magazine that men are being damaged by today's sexual politics. He'll be on the show with Nina Power to discuss why men are in crisis. Rishi Sunak was in San Diego this week for the launch of Aukus, the nuclear submarine agreement between Australia, the US and the UK. Is it a sign that war with China is close? I'll speak to Eyck Freymann and Shashank Joshi. And finally, Cosmo Landesman has a secret. He used to pretend to be working class. Why? He'll join me to explain. Before we get going, if you enjoy Spectator TV, then do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode ever again. And if you want to read more from The Spectator, then why not subscribe to the magazine? For just £12, you can get 12 weeks in print and online and a free £20 Amazon voucher. Just go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer to subscribe. First up, Jeremy Hunt gave his first budget this week. Pension allowances were slashed, there's free childcare, and growth estimates were revised upwards. What does it all mean? I'm joined now by Kate Andrews, the Spectator's economics editor, and David Miles, an economist who works at the OBR and was formerly at the Bank of England. Kate, so we've had Jeremy Hunt's maiden budget as Chancellor. Was it a good news budget?
Good news, bad news. Mixed bag, really. The best news wasn't any particular announcement that Jeremy Hunt made, but rather the forecast around it. I'm sure David can speak a bit to this, but the growth forecasts for the next few years are looking a lot more positive than they were last autumn, around an average of 2% growth per year, and the OBR no longer expects us to move into a technical recession. Now, for a lot of people, this doesn't really make a difference whether or not the economy technically contracts 2 quarters in a row. It doesn't matter as much as their standard of living, which the OBR pointed out is expected to fall quite significantly, especially because in terms of real wages, with inflation, those are going down. So people might not feel all that better off, but it is a much better forecast than we had before. However, the tax burden is on its way to a post-war high in 2024-2025. The OBR expects that the public spending ratio to GDP is going to look like it's sustained around where we were in the 1970s. Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt are presiding over a very big state, and their narrative is that they're doing it responsibly, but the truth is, the idea that with what they're presiding over and their attitude towards the state, that at any point we're going to get major tax cuts. Very hard to see in a budget like this where he's actually borrowing more money.
David, the OBR analysis, as ever, was pretty sobering. What were your main takeaways?
Well, I think Kate's right. I mean, in the near term, there's a bit of good news relative to where we were back in November. The main thing really is that gas prices have fallen so much, and where they look like they're going over the next year or so is a heck of a lot lower. That's good for government spending because it's less expensive to offer the price guarantees. It's good for households because it means that the hit to real disposable income, which is still big, is a bit less big than it would have been. It's particularly useful on inflation. Mm-hmm. So it looks now, to us anyway, our central estimate, informed guess is probably the best way of putting it, is that inflation might get down to a little bit under 3% by the end of the year, coming from just a couple of months ago 11%. So that's a really big fall. That's very helpful to the government as well in the short term because it reduces the cost of a big chunk of government debt, which is this index-linked, inflation-linked government bonds.
Can I ask David quickly on that? Because
Take my job.
I'm so sorry. I'm going to abuse my position in the seat and just quickly ask. I was so startled by that forecast because I think that's the most optimistic one I've seen, that by the end of the year we could actually be quite close to the bank's target, whereas our current inflation figure, we get an update very soon, but is still in double digits. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about the OBR's forecast around that.
Yes, it's largely because of this falling in gas prices, which over the course of this year, if you just use what the market expects the level of gas prices is going to be, the futures price, that's something like 50% lower than it was in November. So that really brings the inflation rate down quite sharply, and it brings it down sharply more quickly than we thought before. So we'd always thought that inflation was likely to fall back to the Bank of England's target, but probably not until the middle of next year. Now that looks like it's almost happened by the end of this year. I think the reason why the OBR forecast looks a bit more optimistic than most other people is that ours is, for the moment anyway, the most recent forecast. So we were able to use the futures prices on gas as they were a couple of weeks ago. For example, the Bank of England's last forecast was 6 or 7 weeks ago. They were looking at where gas prices were forecast by the market to be 7 or 8 weeks ago. And things have moved a lot.
And David, what about the fall in living standards? Because I think that was probably one of the areas where you have lots of the spin from Jeremy Hunt, where it's going to improve, but this is quite significant. And how will consumers feel it?
It's a big fall. We think it's something of the order of 6% decline in real disposable income to the average household in the UK over 2 years. That's historically a very dramatic fall. It's largely a result of where we're coming from, which is just there's been this huge increase in the price level. It's the 11% inflation, and wage settlements haven't kept up with it. And the tax take is creeping up, partly because the kind of indexation of the tax system has been frozen, so more people are moving into higher tax rates. So it's a combination of those things just squeezing household income. I mean, it's almost inevitable when there has been such a big increase in the cost of things that we significantly import into the UK. I mean, somebody's got to take the hit for that. And it ends up one way or another with households.
It's a big number though, isn't it? 3 million dragged into tax, full stop, and then an additional 2 million dragged into a higher rate.
It is, it's significant. And what the government's trying to do, of course, is try and bring the deficit down. And it's got a sort of twin track approach in a way. Government spending as a share of GDP, which has been extraordinarily high, merely falls back to historically high levels. That's actually falling. Tax take is rising because you're trying to squeeze the gap between the two to drive the deficit down so that the stock of debt just doesn't keep on going up. I mean, it's one of those situations where, it's the old cliche, you wouldn't want to start from here, but here's where you have to start from.
And Kate, before we turn to your cover piece and the wider picture, ultimately, a really large chunk of the budget was about the out of work, which falls into three groups: those on benefits, the over 50s. Jeremy Hunt thinks many are on the golf course, and then those who are turning down work because of childcare costs. Can you just talk us through how Jeremy Hunt is trying to tackle this, and whether you think it's going to have much of an impact?
So on pensions, he's scrapping the lifetime allowance. On benefits,
which Labour is opposing.
Which Labour is opposing, specifically, I think, because they don't want it to apply to everyone. They want it specifically to apply to doctors, or they want it to be more narrow.
It's disproportionately doctors and healthcare professionals who are in that bracket anyway, then. Yeah.
Well, Labour are right to point out that you have to be earning a lot of money if you're reaching that limit. But I think the argument on the other side is, if it's a little tricky and a little technical to start singling out professions. Then on childcare, you have the additional subsidy, 30 free hours a week for families in a larger bracket. And then on benefits, you have a range of proposals, including a new universal support scheme, and the idea that this can help more drive people back into work. Now, I think what's quite telling from the OBR's figures is that we're talking about tens, maybe if we're lucky, hundreds of thousands of people, or just over 100,000 people being affected by the range of these schemes. As the Spectator has shown through its data hub, there are 5.2 million people on some kind of out-of-work benefit right now, and job vacancies remain at over 1 million. And the big question for Jeremy Hunt is, I think individually some of these measures are quite good, especially getting rid of the distortions around pensions. Childcare is a bigger question because he's going to be creating even more demand with these so-called free hours in a market that's very tight. There's not loads of supply, and that might actually drive up the cost for people who fall outside of these 30 hours. What that will do to women getting back to work in particular, I don't know. But whatever these measures do, it doesn't really begin to tackle that 5.2 million figure. And so, the question for the government in a relatively short period of time is, are we going to see these improvements? But to what extent will we actually be getting people back into work? It's wonderful for every person who's able to go back, who's able to better their life in that way. But it seems from these schemes there's still going to be a lot of people left out of that, Katie.
And David, do you think we're just going to have to get used to having a high number out of work?
Well, I mean, you're right. The measures that we were considering at the OBR, we thought had a meaningful but not dramatic impact on labour supply 4 or 5 years down the road. I mean, something like 110,000. It's a bit more than that because the childcare measures also, we think, increase the number of hours worked for mothers who are already working, but they just get more generous childcare. It's likely that some will work more. So it's a bit more than just 110,000. The sort of conditionality and trying to get people who are on benefits back into work strategy was when it was actually quite difficult for us to score that firmly because the evidence base is not strong enough yet. It's clear what the intention of the government is, that it may play out over a longer time horizon. If I might just say on the pensions thing, I think the lifetime allowance. It's more than just doctors because there's possibly 400,000 or 500,000 people in the UK who we estimate within the next 5 years would have got close to the £1 million lifetime allowance limit. And it was more about how many of those people, if the lifetime allowance limit is gone, face less of a disincentive to leave work. Mm-hmm. So it was more about them than just about doctors.
And I think that's right, by the way. I'm not really sure the state should be picking and choosing which professions get the tax benefit.
Now, onto your cover piece. Kate, you write in The Spectator this week about a new age of economic uncertainty. Talk us through it.
Yeah, I'm sorry to say there's yet another one. But actually, this topic in the cover this week takes us back to a budget a few years ago when Rishi Sunak, in his March 2021 budget, still really around the height of lockdowns and COVID, but we were being vaccinated, was really looking at that budget not from the perspective of a wide range of policy, but rather from his fear that even a small change to the inflation rate or interest rates to follow to try to tame inflation could really send the public finances into a spiral. And at the time, he was thinking, what if interest rates go up by, say, 1%? In the UK, the base rate is now at 4%. Throughout many countries, interest rates have had to go up very quickly in order to tackle double-digit inflation. And because of that, we are now discovering what this denial around ultra-low interest rates for the past decade, this assumption on the part of virtually everyone that rates were going to be low for long, what consequences that has created. And you've seen very recently the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank, which was so tied up in government bonds that as interest rates rose and those bonds fell in value. There was a run on the bank. But actually in the UK, you can go back to the LDI pension scare last year, which was also linked to market worries that interest rates were going to go up really quickly after that mini budget. And what I try to point to in the piece is that we are talking about historically very normal interest rates. An interest rate of 4 or 5% is not historically a high interest rate. But we are starting to discover these landmines that have been hiding underneath the economy, businesses, sectors that cannot deal with higher interest rates. And that's actually quite worrying because not only could there be meaningful crises to come down the road, but we don't totally know where they are, especially on those LDI pension funds, for example. A House of Lords report that was published last month. This was a regulated sector. This is a highly assessed sector, and the broad consensus was these are fine because they never expected interest rates to go to anywhere like they ended up.
David, I was quite struck by Kate's piece in the sense that I think it is one thing for consumers to be surprised by interest rates going up. So, first-time buyers, perhaps people in my generation who are quite used, almost they've grown up with these historically low interest rates and they think it's normal. And now they're getting a nasty surprise. But you would expect, professionals in these businesses when they're making their decisions to be aware of the fact this could happen. What do you think's gone wrong?
I think what's happened is that, and maybe it's easier to see this in retrospect than at the time, I think central banks have made a mistake, frankly, which is so keen have they been to reduce the worry that people might think they were about to put interest rates up sharply, that they've reinforced a view that these interest rates, which have been until very recently at historically extraordinarily low levels, central banks have been very keen to give the impression that this is how things are very likely to stay for a long time. They've adopted various versions of forward guidance. I mean, the ECB in particular thinking that it is an essential part of their role to say what they think the next several years will be, not just the next few months. And the message has been, until inflation really picked up a few months ago very sharply, maybe a year ago, the message until then was these rates are going to stay very long for a very long period of time. So it's not entirely surprising then that when rates do go up, by historically not very large amounts, I mean, Kate's completely right. The level of interest rates in the UK at 4% is below the 300-year average Bank of England rate, which is about 5%. So it's not that we're at extraordinarily high interest rates. It's that people were encouraged, I think, to believe that they would not rise significantly at all, at least over any time horizon that mattered. I think that's been, frankly, a sort of policy error.
Okay, and we're now in a situation where lots of people are trying to work out where the next horror is lurking. We had the Silicon Valley Bank, there's Credit Suisse. Can you talk us through what's going on there?
There were jitters this week when Credit Suisse's stock shares fell by 20%. I think it hit a historic low. And there was a lot of worry, is this the next in the chain following the Silicon Valley Bank closure? But, it is rebounding. It doesn't seem to be the situation that some people thought it was at the start of the week. But the jitters are legitimate in the sense that nobody really knows the standing of a lot of institutions at the moment. And we've got a great piece to go alongside the cover this week written by Julian Jessup, a sort of a bit of a package. He looks at what could be next, and he talks about government debt, he talks about the housing market, both commercial and individual homes. He looks at a range of things, and the real concern is that having kept interest rates so low as long as we did, things could be bubbling up with, that have been bubbling for 10 years, for 5 years, for a really long period of time. But his piece kind of goes into the details of what we might be looking at.
And David, just finally then, is it time to panic?
It's always worrying when banks that are sort of big names, and Credit Suisse is a big name, get into trouble. I mean, it's not entirely news because they've been in trouble for quite a long time.
People have been whispering about it for a while.
Nonetheless, it makes people look at pretty much all banks and say, what do we not know about them? I think the one reason to feel somewhat reassured, but it is a big reason, is the following. Just before the global financial crisis, in the UK, the banks collectively held deposits or so-called reserves at the central bank, at the Bank of England, which added up to a bit less than £30 billion. They now have £900 billion. In some sense, that is a side effect of quantitative easing, because that's what happens when the central bank buys stuff and hands out money to pay for it, and they've been buying government bonds, and that money flows through the banking system and ends up back in the Bank of England. So you have a banking system in the UK with £900 billion of cash if there's worries about a particular bank that they can draw upon and it's sort of guaranteed to use. There was virtually nothing in the UK banking system at the Bank of England in 2008, which is why when people got worried, it was a crisis immediately.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Kate. Gus Carter, the Spectator's deputy features editor, writes in this week's magazine that men are in crisis. To explain, he joins me now with Nina Power, Economist at Compact magazine. Gus, Nina, thank you for joining Spectator TV this week. Gus, you write in the magazine that young boys are in a bind. Tell us why.
Well, I think the argument that I make in the magazine is that young boys are basically faced with a new form of sexual politics, which treats them as though they're inherently dangerous to girls and young women, that treats them as though they basically can't control their instincts. And we see this in adverts on the tube. There are signs that say unwanted staring is sexual harassment and that kind of thing. But there are also these groups going into schools that are talking to young boys, and they're saying basically masculinity is something that needs to be changed. And they're saying, again, we need to stop violence against women and girls. All things that are, perfectly good and proper. Everyone agrees with that. I think the problem is that in some ways the pendulum has swung to such an extent that boys feel like they can't express any form of masculinity, really.
Nina, do you think that young men in the West are being unfairly vilified?
Yeah, I think we've actually been seeing this for quite a few years now. It's often kind of a media-led campaign to sort of divide the sexes and to present this kind of ongoing sense of suspicion. It's also in the broader context of kind of safetyism, and I think also a kind of lack of a general moral code, sort of following the death of religion, if you like. So nobody really knows how to behave with each other anymore. And I think this has given rise to a kind of paranoia, which has largely been aimed at men and as Gus says, their sort of supposed or purported inability to contain themselves.
And Gus, where do you think the problem is starting, or I suppose stemming from here? Because one of the things you write in your piece about is what children are being told in schools. So there's one example of, I think, just a boy messaging a girl, and apparently that was a problem.
Yes, I mean that's an extraordinary story from a friend whose son's at an English day school, and he texted a girl from another school, basically just saying hello. And he was called up in front of the school authorities to explain his behaviour for the criminal act of unsolicited contact with a girl. I think the problem here is that children need to be exposed to different elements or different parts of kind of adult life, right? That's part of growing up. People need to learn how to have relationships. People need to learn how to deal with the kind of messiness of human life. And what we're doing is we're denying children that opportunity. And I think it's turning them into slightly kind of scared, sad, and withdrawn individuals. And I think it's a problem particularly with boys. But I mean, Nina made the point that that it's kind of pitting the sexes against each other. That's totally true. I mean, this isn't an argument that somehow girls or women are mistreating men. That isn't it at all. It's more a kind of culture, as Nina says, of safetyism.
And Nina, on that, do you think that what we're seeing here is, when we talk about rebranding masculinity, is there a risk that at least some of the people saying that is just almost ending masculinity and replacing it more with femininity?
Yeah, I think that's definitely happening, and it goes alongside the kind of feminization of the economy as well, and the sort of devaluing of sort of traditionally or typically male interests and talents and skills, so that everyone almost is being pushed towards becoming more feminine, which isn't good for men and it isn't good for women either, actually, so that we end up with this kind of totally proximate society in which men and women are kind of almost like siblings, rather than in any more interesting relation, let's say, of like compatibility or companionship or like complementarity. We don't kind of think of the relationship between men and women in that way very often, which is unfortunate, because in a way that is what we need to get along, whether it's as friends or as married couples, or and there's not enough value or time given to those kind of relations, I think.
And Gus, I suppose on that, we can talk about those who, and we've got plenty of examples in your piece, who are ultimately, in a way you could argue, trying to end masculinity as opposed to rebranding what their real motive is. But of course, you also have concerns, and perhaps it's what we see more in the media, that there is something called toxic masculinity. So for example, if you look at Andrew Tate, that is someone that head teachers have been really concerned about. They think, lots of, if you ask your average person on the street, they might not know who that person is, or they may now have to recent stories. But yet that person was very well known amongst pupil age, and it is teaching boys bad attitudes. Do you think there's a problem then, I suppose, with on the side of masculinity, that there are some people who are putting forward a toxic version of it?
Oh, totally. I totally agree with that. I mean, if you look at some of the things Andrew Tate says, they're just, totally objectionable. It's not an argument about defending people like Andrew Tate. But I think what's happened is that you've had other people like Jordan Peterson, people like Joe Rogan, who do exude a form of masculinity and put forward a kind of vision of masculinity. And those people are treated as kind of extremists too. I think you can disagree with people like Jordan Peterson. I certainly don't think he's an extremist, but part of the problem is when you treat those kinds of people in that way, you give rise to an even kind of further, more extreme kind of version. Further, yeah, exactly. And I think that's part of the problem, it's one of those things that's often decried in the media, the fact that there aren't, very many male role models anymore. But when they do pop up, they are kind of ruthlessly attacked. And so the boys, go looking for something even more kind of extreme and mental.
Nina, do you agree with that?
Yes, I mean, I would say someone like Andrew Tate could be seen as a kind of symptom. You know, he's subversive and attractive precisely because partly he's saying things that you're not really allowed to say according to the mainstream dominant regime ideology, you know, which isn't to defend Andrew Tate at all. And I think, you know, I agree with Gus in the sense that even very moderate and mild positions like Jordan Peterson's, which is basically fundamentally telling young men to sort of sort themselves out and stop blaming the world and women for their problems and just get things in order, which is, you know, really kind of basic stuff, but, you know, delivered in this kind of patrician 1950s absent father figure, which I think is a big part of the problem. Kind of way. And I think what's generally missing is the question of virtue. Like, there isn't enough room to say, what does it mean to be a good man? Right. So figures like men like Tate are presented, well, this is how you get on in the world through status and being, I don't know, really quite unpleasant. But what we really need is just kind of men, well, the possibility for men and young boys to be good, rather than this kind of fundamental assumption that there's something wrong with men, or that, you know, boys and men are fundamentally badly aligned, or, you know, which can't be the case, right? If we want to get on together, we have to allow that both men and women are moral agents as well. And so therefore we can talk about what it means to be a good man and what it means to be a good woman, and what it means to be together in a better way, basically.
Nina, I'm really interested in your point about virtue and about ethics. I think there was an interesting item in Charles Moore's notes last week when he pointed to, and this is a bit of a kind of side comment, but where he pointed to the civil service, where they're hiring kind of ethics officers. And there's almost this sense of kind of ethics and virtue being something that's done by specialists now, rather than something that we all have to deal with in our own lives. And when you do that, when you remove it, something else is going to come in and fill the gap. We just kind of don't even think about it in moral terms.
No, exactly. It's a total absence, you know, and I think it's part of being in a kind of post-Christian, very mixed world that's also filled with very contradictory imperatives. Like, you know, young men are often watching a lot of pornography. I mean, that gives you a vision of the world which is like overwhelmingly sexual, you know, and a lot of young men then start to see the world in that way, you know, exhibit and experience shame. They can't interact normally. But we need a much more kind of integrated culture that says, look, there are all these things you could possibly do, but some of them are actually bad for you and they're bad for society as a whole. You know, we don't tend to think in that kind of socially integrated way. We think that everything is an individual decision and that desire is good and whatever people want is good. But this selfishness, this selfish society, completely mitigates against any collective project of virtue.
So, Gus, what do you think the answer is here when it comes to stopping this group feeling as though they are being isolated and they're being pushed, you know, further in a certain direction? Is it less interference?
I don't really know. I kind of didn't get into it in the piece, and I almost did that on purpose because I don't know what the answers are. I think if there was someone here kind of disagreeing with me and Nina, they would be saying, but hang on, there's a huge problem with sexual assault. You know, I talk to my female friends and they say, you don't realize what it's like to sit on the tube on your own. You know, you're constantly bombarded by men, you know, behaving inappropriately. And I totally understand that. It seems like a very difficult problem to solve. I think part of the way of doing it though is allowing people the space to kind of make mistakes almost. So the woman that started Everyone's Invited, which is the movement that kind of led to a lot of these like boyhood initiatives and you know, a lot of discussions about toxic masculinity, and it came about because there were a lot of accusations of sex assault at kind of big English private schools. She said when she launched it, she didn't want it to become kind of cover for cancel culture. She didn't want children to be kind of attacked for making mistakes. She just said she wanted people to recognize that there was a problem and you know, in order to kind of better deal with it. But it shouldn't have been a kind of cancel culture thing. And I think maybe that's where we're going wrong, you know. I mean, there's an example I use in the piece of a school in Essex where they've totally banned children from having any romantic relationships, from even touching each other, even hugs, and that's clearly a sign of an institution that's terrified of of people making mistakes, of people getting upset, people being unhappy. That's part of being in relationships.
And Nina, I suppose on Gus's point, which is, lots of people will say, well, look at all these examples in the past in terms of men behaving badly. If you look at harassment rates and so forth, you do need to have, the way to stop this is to, try and stem the problem early on, hence these talks in schools. So what would you say to them?
Yeah, I think I agree with Gus that there's this kind of, we have to allow people to make mistakes. I mean, we all make mistakes, and a lot of things are not badly intended, right? There's obviously a difference between somebody kind of intentionally upsetting somebody or behaving in a way that's kind of clearly goes against their wishes. But most of the time, in a lot of these kind of interactions, especially among teenagers, they're more awkward than badly intended, I think. And, to lump everything in together and to kind of infantilize everyone and keep them protected and keep them safe isn't going to allow people to become mature and become adult, which is partly arrived at through making mistakes. And that goes for girls and boys as well. It's not only boys making mistakes. So I think, we're going to end up with a kind of culture of permanent children who are sort of very scared and overprotected. And I think this isn't really the way to proceed. It doesn't set you up for dealing with the reality of life and its inevitable suffering. In fact, trying to keep people from suffering actually makes them suffer more, right? So again, it's a very complicated question. I mean, I read Soma Serra's book and looked at the Everyone's Invited project. And really the only conclusion you could draw from the kind of terrifying picture that she paints of what it's like to be at schools is to go to single-sex schools and to keep boys and girls completely segregated until they're about 21 or something. I mean, it's really what she's describing as a kind of horrific environment filled with, boys just completely influenced by pornography. And, that may be worse. That may be worse than it was when we were at school. I'm not going to deny that, having porn on your phone is maybe more, of course, it's a different world in some ways. But I think the conclusion can't necessarily be that kind of total segregation. Then we're back to almost like a religious society, almost a theocracy. And we might need better ways of young men and women spending time together. We might need more thought about what rituals we have, right? But I think we're looking at a very kind of imbalanced picture, either total segregation or this kind of liberal free-for-all, and neither of which seem particularly satisfying.
I was going to say, Nina, on your point about infantilization and about making people more anxious by trying to stop them from suffering, I think we kind of risk going into a bit of a death spiral here in a way, because, and I'm going to say something quite kind of controversial, but I think part of the problem is that there's been a massive expansion in the definition of what kind of sexual misconduct is in the first place. So if you look at statistics on sex assault in schools from about 10, 15 years ago, it's much, much lower than the figures were in 2021. And I think part of that is because definitions are changing and definitions are expanding. And then that seems to almost encourage this kind of culture to go further, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, for sure.
And Gus, just finally, we're obviously at a period where, we're talking about schoolboys particularly, we've had the pandemic, which has meant even less social interaction than these people would have normally. I think, as Nina was touching on, if you are lurking in chat rooms, watching porn, and you're not actually speaking to people, this idea, that is one form of segregation in of itself. Do you think, despite all these attempts to almost keep boys and girls separate, that more interaction is actually the answer to normalise these relationships? Oh, totally.
And it's a form of self-segregation. It's the boys kind of withdrawing themselves, I think, because of this feeling that they can't really get anything right at all. It's a lot easier to just sit in your bedroom for most of your teens and 20s. You're not going to get in trouble with anyone. Sat there having a rather sad life, sat in your bed. One of the people I speak to in the piece is a child psychologist called Julie Lynn Evans, and when I spoke to her, she said the problem here is that is that boys and girls are being kind of pitted against each other, and girls are being told boys are dangerous, boys are being told, you're a danger unto yourself and others. And actually, it's untrue and it's unhelpful. The girls want boyfriends as much as the boys want girlfriends. And, if we're going to continue as a society, people need to, get married, have kids. That's how we continue as a species.
So also important to the future of mankind.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Gus. Thank you, Nina, for joining Spectator TV. Rishi Sunak met with Joe Biden and Anthony Albanese this week to finalise the details of the Aukus nuclear submarine pact. Eyck Freymann, director of Indo-Pacific at Green Mantle advisory firm, writes in this week's magazine about how Britain can do even more to help combat China in the Pacific. To discuss, he joins me now with Shashank Joshi, defence editor at The Economist. Thank you for joining Spectator TV this week. Just to begin the conversation, Eyck, how seriously should we take the threat that China poses to Taiwan?
I think the answer is very seriously indeed. China regards Taiwan as an existential issue, a question of historical justice and the resolution of the civil war that ended in 1949. China is also afraid, not unreasonably, that many people on Taiwan want to formalize Taiwan's de facto independence by striking some sort of political arrangement with the United States. So even if China is not planning an outright invasion of Taiwan, China needs to dial up the military pressure on both Taiwan and the United States to make sure that they're deterred from doing this.
And Shashank, when it comes to force, how can we compare what China has, not just to Taiwan, because I think we probably could work out the answer to that, but what allies would offer, such as America potentially, if we did face a potential standoff?
I think the point is that the gap has been growing dramatically in the last 10 years or so, particularly in the naval realm. China's navy is the biggest in the world. Between 2014 and 2018, it produced vessels of more tonnage than the entire Indian Navy or French Navy in total, which gives you a sense of just how gargantuan that buildup is. And in some areas, notably in conventional missiles, but also air defense and certain other areas, we're seeing a significant Chinese advantage. And I think the challenge for the Americans is how do they make sure that the air bases they've traditionally had in countries like Japan survive in the face of a big onslaught of missiles? So they're working extremely hard to try and disperse those forces as widely as possible.
And when we're looking at, obviously, the big announcement this week when it comes to Aukus, you had, I think two of the original leaders at the time when Aukus was first unveiled have now moved off, and we have new leaders in their place. But the agreement stays strong. And how is that, do you think, impacting all this in the sense that it's a big boost to Taiwan?
I think that Aukus is more about Australia's security and essential role in the emerging architecture of Indo-Pacific regional security than it has about Taiwan. Australia hasn't committed in advance to participating in any defensive exercises around Taiwan, nor have they committed to participating in a war. And I think that's probably sensible for Australia's national interest. I think it's also a question whether the UK would want to participate. It would depend on the context of how a Taiwan war were to come about. That said, I think it's definitely in the interest of the United States, Britain, and Australia to tighten their collaboration in high-tech military development and in exercises, because the more tightly relevant countries are in the region, intertwined in a vision for a secure and stable Indo-Pacific, the more China is likely to be deterred from causing trouble.
I think, Katie, I think Eyck is right. But all I'd say is that I think it is looking increasingly difficult politically that Australia could stay out of a war over Taiwan, in the same way that I think it would be increasingly difficult for Japan to stay out of a war. These navies are going to be integrated. America is going to be increasingly reliant on bomber bases in the north of Australia, submarine ports in the west of Australia, and the politics of turning around to America in what would be the biggest war since 1945 and saying, sorry, we're sitting this one out. To me, that just seems implausible. For Europeans, it's a slightly different issue. But even for us, I think we're going to find it increasingly hard to say we're sitting this one out.
And on that, Shashank, we saw a situation where effectively, Beijing have voiced their unhappiness over that Aukus announcement. So you have a situation where, yes, Taiwan itself, perhaps not, is not a key part, but the general sense, particularly perceived in China, of aggression towards China, does I think probably have an effect in making China think about its options.
They once hoped that Taiwan could be unified with the mainland by peaceful means, by economic absorption, trade ties, economic ties, social ties. What's actually happened is Taiwanese people look at the fate of Hong Kong and understand, that's not what we would like. They increasingly identify as Taiwanese rather than Chinese in terms of their identity. And so that has pushed the Chinese into a more radical position. But I think as much as we prepare for a potential military conflict with China and deter the Chinese, there's also an acute sense we also want to deter Taiwan from anything rash. We've been very lucky to have a Taiwanese president for the last several years who has been very pragmatic and sensible, who hasn't pushed for anything radical, anything that's rocked the boat substantially. That may not be the case for the next 10 years. And so from an American perspective, a European perspective, this isn't just about deterring the Chinese, it's also about making sure the Taiwanese don't do anything that dramatically changes their status and their position across the strait.
And Eyck, on Taiwan, could you just explain to viewers what the strategic significance of Taiwan is, particularly when we're talking about, for example, semiconductors?
Well, Taiwan is essentially important to the architecture of security in the broader region. And it starts with geography itself. General Douglas MacArthur, who commanded U.S. forces in the Pacific in World War II, once called Taiwan an unsinkable aircraft carrier in the first island chain. If you look at a map, you can trace a line of islands down from the Japanese archipelago to Taiwan and the Philippines, down to Indonesia and Australia. The U.S. concept for how to maintain order in the Pacific since 1945 has been to maintain a network of bases and relationships on those islands. Because it's very hard to take an island with an amphibious invasion across an ocean, this represents a line of defense that contains at first Russian and now Chinese expansion outward. It's also very important from a naval point of view, because if you look on a map, you may not notice this, but you have to look at a topographic map. It's actually very difficult to get ships out from within that first island chain, right off of China's coasts, into the wider waters of the Pacific. This is important for naval ships and especially submarines. If the United States and Taiwan are working together, especially with Japan and the Philippines, they can largely contain the Chinese Navy to just 100 miles or so off of its coasts. But if China is able to take control of Taiwan, they can project naval power outward. They can threaten Japan. They can threaten to encircle and blockade the Philippines. And all of a sudden, they are able to project forces much further into the Pacific, even threatening the United States homeland. So that's the geographic reason why Taiwan matters. But Taiwan also matters because it's become an essential component of this integrated, high-tech global economy. Over 90% of the world's advanced semiconductors are made in Taiwan, and semiconductors make our modern world run, everything from autos to iPhones. The United States obviously can't let these facilities fall into Chinese hands. And in fact, they've communicated that if there were a war, the Americans would destroy these facilities rather than lose control of them. But from China's perspective, if the United States is going to cut off their access to these facilities anyway, it might be better to strike Taiwan just to level the playing field. So this is the quandary. The U.S. needs to preserve its competitive advantages in collaboration with allies, but the very steps that it could take to preserve those advantages could incentivize China to strike.
And Shashank, on semiconductors, are we seeing Western countries such as America take steps when it comes to obviously having self-sufficiency in terms of their own supplies?
They're certainly trying to achieve that, but it's extremely difficult because this is a field in which the capital investment necessary to produce semiconductors, particularly the fabs that sort of produce these things, is enormous, absolutely enormous, staggering amounts. The technologies are highly concentrated. And so, for example, in terms of lithography, one of the key techniques in the production of semiconductors, it's ASML in the Netherlands, which has absolutely vital expertise. So it isn't just, as if America has everything it needs. Yes, America is passed laws trying to onshore some of this production, and there are very sound reasons. You don't want to depend for your entire economic security and semiconductor supply chain on a small island that is within range of many thousands of Chinese missiles and at risk of invasion. But I have to say that however much you invest in this, however hard you try, and however much you talk to the South Koreans and the Japanese and others and try and put production facilities back in the United States, you're still going to be quite dependent for the foreseeable future on TSMC, which is this flagship Taiwanese semiconductor firm. And I think it raises some fascinating questions, thinking more perhaps in macabre fashion as to if there was an invasion, what would the US, Taiwan and others do in terms of considering the destruction of those facilities to avoid them falling into the hands of the Chinese government?
And I remember in previous interviews when we talked about Ukraine, for example, often Taiwan comes up, and there definitely was, I think, growing consensus amongst some experts on the issue. They thought how Russia had been impacted by the invasion of Ukraine would put China off actually trying to take Taiwan. Do you think that's still seen as the case, or actually it does feel as though alarm is growing, and up to this point more so?
The Ukraine issue is complex, and it has had both pros and cons for China. On balance, I think it's quite clear that the cons outweigh the pros. From China's perspective, the war in Ukraine has shown that Western unity is possible. It's shown that a military force that is well-funded, that is considered by many around the world to be an extremely impressive fighting force, can collapse in operational mismanagement and be held at bay by a much smaller adversary. From China's perspective, I think this should seriously call into question the fighting ability of the People's Liberation Army, which, let's face it, hasn't fought a major war since 1979 and is mostly thinking about this invasion through studying it in books. So from China's perspective, there have been some advantages. For example, Russia having been largely cut off from the US financial system, having been forced through this oil price cap scheme to sell its oil at a much discounted price, has provided some economic advantages to Chinese industry, and it's put Russia in a position of geostrategic submission, where it essentially has to listen to China's requests more seriously and potentially do what China asks. Russia would be an essential partner for China in any Taiwan contingency, and Xi Jinping recognizes this, which is why he hasn't thrown Putin under the bus. But that said, if I'm Xi Jinping, the external environment that I face today, in terms of the unity of purpose in my adversaries, is much more unfavorable than it was on February 23rd, 2022. And I think that is why Western powers, and not just the United States, but many of its allies and partners in Asia, recognize that the outcome of the Ukraine war will be very important in what it signals to China. And that's one of the reasons why the South Koreans, the Japanese, and others have been working more closely with NATO to try to make sure that Western unity is maintained.
Shashank, on that point, I wondered, I suppose on the flip side, is there a time incentive for China to act in the next few years as opposed to waiting longer?
There's, I think, two things at work here for the Chinese. One of them is to do with their own national power, and that's the consideration of the so-called peak China hypothesis. Has China's economic growth peaked? Are there serious structural problems in their economy that may manifest over the next 10 years and curb the very high growth rates they've seen over the past 15 years? And also demographically, are they in substantial decline? So that's one question. Is there a shrinking window of opportunity? I certainly believe that one of the reasons Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine last year was not because he necessarily thought it would be entirely straightforward, but because he felt it would be increasingly difficult over another 5 to 10 years. The flip side of that is American strength. If you look at American war games, lots of them find that America is at risk of losing a war over Taiwan. But what you do also find is if they factor in additional investments made in the Pentagon, particularly the procurement of new types of weapons, long-range drones, extra munitions, long-range anti-ship missiles, that this aids America's ability to resist a Chinese invasion, but none of that's going to happen for another five plus years. And so, from a Chinese perspective, would you rather fight the U.S. force that exists today without those long-range munitions, without those new concept of operations and approaches that disperse their forces across the Pacific, or would you rather fight the one in 10 years' time that may have solved some of those problems? Again, I think that may contribute to a Chinese sense of a closing window of opportunity. I don't think that means a Chinese invasion is likely. I think it is actually less likely than not in the next 5 years. But one can see how those factors will shape the People's Liberation Army's thinking.
And I just finally, I'd like to know whether you agreed with that in terms of less likely than not. And finally, if we did end up there, what do you think the chances are of a conflict like this being contained rather than ending up in a World War III?
Well, look, I think China has definitely communicated that it's trying to modernize its military with the goal of gaining the capability of seizing Taiwan by force. That doesn't mean that they intend to do it, and that doesn't mean that they have a deadline to do it. There's any number of reasons why China would want to have that capability for political reasons. It gives them more leverage over Taiwan and over the United States to coerce them into getting the outcomes that it wants by peaceful means. Look, there is a debate within the China studies community about just what is the nature of China's interest in Taiwan. To what extent is it emotional and symbolic and based on Chinese history and the fundamental ontology of the Chinese Communist Party? And to what extent is it opportunistic and geopolitical? And there's a legitimate debate with reasonable arguments on both sides. But I think what is undeniable is that any war with the United States, and certainly a war with the United States and its regional allies, would be devastating for China, would make it virtually impossible for China to achieve all of its other aspirations that it calls national rejuvenation, which is essentially building a fully advanced modern economy in which the Chinese people are made rich and influential on the world stage. So I think China is disincentivized to provoke such a conflict unless it thinks its hand is forced. And while the peak China hypothesis is probably true for demographic reasons, China's population is peaking, its economy is slowing down, just because it faces a closing window of opportunity doesn't mean it will start a war if it thinks it's going to lose. Look, I'm 29 years old. I face a declining window of opportunity to become an Olympic figure skater, but that doesn't mean I'm going to succeed if I try. What we have to think about, though, as not just as an American, but also as a network of allies and partners with a stake in stability, is how we manage China's insecurity as it peaks and begins to decline. China is very afraid that the United States and Taiwan in the future will exploit China's weakness in order to change the status quo fundamentally and lock in Taiwan independence. And so at the same time as we work to deter China, we also need to reassure China that if they don't initiate a conflict, that we will respect their red lines and that we can continue to maintain a status quo that is acceptable to them over the longer term.
Thank you both for joining Spectator TV today. And finally, Cosmo Landesman writes in this week's magazine about how he used to pretend to be working class. Why did he do it? I'm joined by Cosmo now. Cosmo, thank you for joining Spectator TV this week.
It's a pleasure.
You have a confession to make in the magazine about pretending to be working class.
Yes, I did.
Can you take us through your journey, how it came to be?
It started back in the mid-'60s when my parents, who were American, moved to London. And I found myself after a couple of years in a very tough, comprehensive school in North London, where everyone were sort of, in gangs and geezers, and it was a very working class school. I think there were 2 middle class boys there. And to adapt, it was a question of adapt and survive. I didn't want to be mocked. I wanted to be like, when you're a teenager, when you're a peer, you want to be like your peers and all your mates. So I wanted to be working class too. So I had to learn very quickly how to do this. And
how did you?
I just imitated everyone else. I started to dress differently. You see, I came from 2 different worlds. My world was my parents' world was middle class, bohemian, arty world, and I had a lot of friends in that world. But I had these new group of mates, and they did things very differently. And I had to learn to get the right clothes, try to get the accent, try to have the attitude, the swagger, the toughness, just to survive.
And I suppose just For our viewers, there's quite an interesting debate these days about what counts as working class. So there's some on the left who say it should be about what you earn and your lifestyle, as opposed to the roots you come from. But at the time, what do you think made you middle class compared to your peers?
Well, I'm not going to deny there were certain economic differences, but I think you have to go back to those days. There was a much more stricter cultural division between middle class people and working class people. If you went to the homes of working class people and looked in their fridge, you would see certain things. And if you went to the homes of middle class people, you would see other things. So that kind of cultural homogenous thing. Well, in middle class homes, you would find, Whole Foods and brown bread and all this. So this was just when the beginning of the whole health consciousness thing was beginning. Working class people had delicious white bread and strawberry jam, didn't worry about sugar or diets or all this stuff. It was a very different kind of lifestyle trend.
So when you were pretending to be working class, were you successful?
That's a really good question. At the time, I thought I was, but looking back, I must have been completely deluded. I don't think first of all, I had a much more pronounced American accent. I think I only became successful when I made it into the school football team. Then I was finally accepted.
And while you were keeping up your working class act, did it mean that you couldn't invite friends to your parents' house?
Absolutely not.
Yeah,
They would completely blow. If they saw my hippie parents, it was all over.
And then at what point did you start to have the confidence to give up the act?
About 30 years later. I mean, I'd like to think that I've totally given up the act, but I still find myself, when I'm speaking to a certain person, I slip into the old Dick Van Dyke accent of mine, and I start to...
Can you do it for us now?
No, because it's too embarrassing. It's like,
just so we can
cheers,
work out.
Mate, can you fix this? Right, Governor. It's just like embarrassing.
Have any of the friends that you put it on the strongest with seen your evolution to a more honest version of yourself?
I think my two wives who were both working class, and when I would go to stay with their parents, I would suddenly I'd break into Dick Van Dyke mode. And they said, why are you talking in that ridiculous way? And I just couldn't help myself.
And Cosmo, during this period of your life, were you ever really caught out?
Well, I think people had suspicions. But I think it's to the credit of my working class companions and friends is they never called me on it. I think they took pity on me trying to pass, and they just kind of ignored my silly accent.
And I think it's an interesting one because we often talk about, a lot of people say, if you're working class in the past, you haven't had opportunities that others have. So there can be a desire by some to almost suggest the other way, that they're posher than they really are. Why do you think you did it for so long? I mean, after school, perhaps you did it at school to fit in. Did you then find that you kept going along with it, or did it fit your politics more? Well,
I think you've also got to put it in after I left school, the whole cultural trend with the rise of pop culture, rock music, it was cool to be working class. No self-respecting middle class kid wanted to be considered middle class. Everybody was dropping. That's the thing I'm trying to point out. Everyone was dropping their ages, particularly during the time of punk, and then after punk, in the 80s, when guys like the Spandau Boys were very prevalent. Everybody wanted to have that. It was called street cred, and middle class people struggled to have street cred, especially if you went to Eton or Oxford.
Do you think we still see that today? Is almost a timeless trend? Because in the Labour Party, for example, there's definitely Labour politicians who will like to give the idea that they are quite working class and not supposed to. Actually, you went to this school.
Yes, I think there is that problem. Still, the faking of the English working class is still going on today, but I don't know if it's so much in the cultural realm. In the cultural realm, the middle class people, like Florence and the Machine, people who went to public school aren't so apologetic. They don't try and be. The whole trend has moved away from that now, I think. It's no longer as cool to be working class or perceived to be working class.
And what do you think is the worst class to be perceived as now? Do you think there's a stereotype around being upper class? What do you think the social stereotype is?
Well, I think the upper class and the working class have always gotten on. They always had things in common: love horses, love, racing, gambling, drinking, things like that. I know it's a bit of a stereotype. I think both classes tend to look down on the middle classes. I think it's the middle class that have a tough time.
The aspirational middle class.
Yes, aspirational, who want to move in those circles.
Yeah, either can't be working class or they try too hard to be something they're not.
Yes, right.
Yeah, I always remember, I think it was quite summed up during, Brexit, when soon after the Leave result, you heard Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, journalists camped out both their houses, and you had Michael Gove come out with his wife to give, cups of tea, and it was a beautiful, Emma Wedgwood set, everything was in keeping. And then you heard Boris Johnson go out and it was a Sports Direct mug, a mini egg mug. And as I said, that is the difference between middle class and upper class.
Yes, that sums it up, yeah.
Thank you for coming on today, Cosmo. That's it for this week. If you enjoy Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel, click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss any of our videos. Thanks again for watching and do join us again next week.